So I've done quite a bit of cleanup, brought back some of the original features that I liked from the procedural, and of course there's still a few things here or there that might need to be modified. But let's go ahead and proceed to creating our water object that's going to be the waterfall itself and all of the water. So what we're going to be doing for this is going into the procedural terrain, and opening up the terrain editor. And there is more than one way we can do this. Whether or not we want to convert to a standard terrain and paint in the water on the standard terrain, or paint it in on the procedural so that we can have it on the main terrain, because the procedural is pretty much going to stay as a procedural terrain. Depending on how much definition we need or how much we get out of the material, we might not need as much detail as procedural terrain will give us. Because some of the areas of the terrain have a very low pixel amount, it might be better to paint the material. Either way, the material is going to have the same 2048 by 2048 unless we increase the overall detail. I think it's going to be better to do that with the standard terrain and not really even worrying about sampling the procedural terrain material. We can always copy and paste everything over to the other terrain. So actually what I am going to do is copy and paste this terrain. So we now have a secondary terrain. I'm going to edit the object, and once the OpenGL loads and the mesh is created, we're going to convert it over to a standard terrain, and then we'll be able to work with this terrain much easier, and the refresh times will be much quicker. Plus, we can still use the same material distributions to apply to the procedural terrain, so either way it ends up being quicker. So now the terrain is loaded in, and what we can do is go up to the top and convert it to a standard. So it is going to have to regenerate everything over again, but then we'll have a matching standard terrain with the resolution set to 2048 by 2048 until we go ahead and double that res. So once the standard terrain is created, we can the ×2 up on top, and now we have 4096 by 4096. Which means that our painted layers are going to be a higher resolution, which is going to be much better for what we're going to be doing with this. Plus we can, like I was saying, take those painted layers and bring them over to the procedural terrain. So what we want to do right now is add a new layer. We can decide to remove the dirt layer. Actually, we can just go ahead and just delete it. We're going to add a new layer, and you can really pick whatever you want for this. It's not really going to matter at this point. This is purely for the water, although we may be able to use it in other areas. I'm going to keep something that's just kind of render a little quicker and just use one of my dirt materials again, setting its color to a blue so that we can tell where the water is going to be. And all we need to do is basically trace out the points in which where the water is going to be placed. We're going to have to make modifications to the mesh because we don't want the water to exist in the exact same place as the terrain itself. We do want it to sort of be inflated. So we're going to go ahead and start with this kind of main area using a smaller brush, increasing the flow, and just painting in. And now it doesn't need to be completely perfect, because we can always come back and modify it if needed. This is really just going to give us our geometry that we need to create the water. And depending on how far back you're going to have your render, is how far back you need to set the painted material to go into the terrain, making sure that you look at it from different angles in order to fill everything in. So then we're going to come down, painting the vertical areas. And I am doing quite a few waterfalls right now. This is much easier for a scene with just one waterfall on a terrain where it's kind of the main part of the terrain. But I like to make things difficult and create a larger scene. So that way we can have lots of different types of waterfalls and different techniques covered if needed, in order to be able to see the most efficient way for you to do it with your specific scenes. So I'm just going to go through, and another thing to keep in mind is if you go around some of these peaks, you can create some really nice water effects that way. And I'm probably going to end up going back and under the first layer and just removing the areas that are not needed. And that way we can just have where the water is going to show. But we are going to be able to manipulate the water just as we would a terrain. So once I've gone ahead and finished grabbing the water and painting it in, creating this layer, we'll be able to move on to the next step. So I'm going to continue with this, and if I think anything's important, I'll jump back in while I'm working on it and give you a few pointers. Okay, so I finished up painting just kind of where the water is going to be, where the different falls are, and kind of going down into the rivers, at least very roughly. A lot of what we're going to be doing next is going to clean up the shape of everything we're going to turn out with here. So first I'm going to go ahead and just click OK to apply this to the mesh. And I'm also going to go ahead and save the scene. And then I am going to create another duplicate to cut from. And before we can even cut out the part of the terrain we want, we do need to save out the image. So I'm going to go ahead and select our terrain, copy and paste, and then go over to the Links tab where we have our two different maps. One is going to be that original dirt we had created, and the other one is our new one, which is the one that's showing up blacker right now. We can increase the scale to be able to see that a little better. So what we can do is right-click and export the link. I am going to export this as a bitmap file. And the reason I'm going to export it as a bitmap rather than a TIFF file or a higher quality or better sized image is because Vue does tend to have a few problems with some of the TIFF files from what I've noticed. So I'm just going to save as a bitmap, which is pretty much the default, and that should give us the kind of map we need. Now, to create the water and the falls, we are going to need to downsample the terrain in order for the image map to really create the geometry we need. Since we've already saved out the image map and the painted layer, we don't even need to worry about the terrain material anymore because that's already saved. So what I'm going to do is downsample the terrain, the standard terrain, not the procedural, and bring it down to 512 by 512. So a lot of smoothing overall throughout the terrain. And once we load the image in, even though it's a much higher resolution, it will create larger areas rather than sharp peaks. So what we want to do is go to Options, or sorry, go to Picture, and we can load in that image. And what I want to do is set this to the subtract mode, and we just want to adjust the slider so that it's subtracting the bottom, and we can just drag it over up until we start to see the lower areas showing back up. And I notice this is really around 30%. We can preview it, and if that's acceptable, we can click OK. Alright, I'm going to try that again, since it did crash the program. It hasn't done that before for this situation, so I'll go ahead and try it again. To try to avoid that crash, what I'm going to do is reset the material on the standard terrain, and then go to Edit It. It is quite possible that it was those material layers possibly causing that error. I've noticed a few problems with the painted texture maps. We'll have to see. But it did work before, no problem. So I'm going to go ahead and just downsample this once again to 512, go to the picture, and we can load back in that saved image. Go to Subtract, set it to 30, and click OK. And it looks like maybe I need to preview it first. Otherwise, it is possible that the image itself is causing the error. I haven't run into this problem doing this before, so I am going to find another solution. And I did get it to work, so I'm going to repeat the process and show you what I did. First, I cleared out the material, resetting it, same as before. Then I copied and pasted the terrain to create a duplicate. It is possible that there was something still connected to the object causing an issue, so by copying and pasting it, it does create a new terrain that does remove some of those links that sometimes are left over. So then, going back, downsampling the terrain, I also went and clicked OK afterwards to apply that, then went back and edited the object in the terrain editor, went to Picture, and loaded in that image. Setting it to subtract, 30%, hitting Enter after typing in 30, previewing, and clicking OK. So that did work successfully. So the next thing I'm going to do is we need to fill in these areas a little bit more. Now I did go into Photoshop and blur out the image, which is my version 2 copy. We can use that to overlay, add on top of it, but we should be able to use just the global effects in order to spread this out a little bit more. Because we do actually want it to be quite jagged in order to get a nice waterfall. Now one thing that's really going to spread this out is by using the Plateaus under Effects. So we can click on that, and that really is going to just add a lot of geometry to the edges and get rid of those jagged edges. Because the terrain was resampled, there is an edge that needs to be dealt with. So what we want to do is go to Altitude, sample the lowest point, and then we can just brush that in. And if you have the airbrush mode on, you can just hold down the mouse, or using pen tablet, just keep pressing, and it will remove all of that edge. So you might just have to go over it once or twice depending on the flow. So now we can go back to the Effects tab. We can also clip out the lower portion of that terrain. And then I'm going to hit Plateaus again. If we're still having a little bit of an issue with the altitude, or that edge pixel showing Now, a lot of times you can use the glaciation filter. Unfortunately, that's going to basically destroy the terrain. We might be able to constrain to the clipping range, however. So I'm going to go ahead and just clip down just to the lower portion, constrain to clipping range, go to Effects, and use glaciation. We can start to see that edge pixel showing up a little bit more. Go back to the altitude, and we might just need to do this as a final after we're all done editing everything, because that sampling is just kind of bad. So going to the effects, I am going to add some plateaus once again, and then increase and double the resolution of the terrain. And going back once again and removing the edge pixel that was showing up. So now I'm going to clip this out on the bottom, and we can apply a few more effects because we do need to smooth it out just a little. We can use a little bit of the alluvium filter. We can dissolve, and then use sharpen, make it very crisp. Add in gravel, stones, grit, pebbles, alluvium, applying the alluvium, a little dissolve, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at that. So we have a pretty thick object overall. If we need to reduce the overall look of it, there's a couple of things we can do. We can use the wind filter, which will cut it down, or we can go use the glaciation filter. The only problem with that is it will start to dip down and unequalize the altitude levels. So sometimes some of the other filters might be a little bit better, or not using plateaus so much. So I might end up making another copy, but we'll have to see. We'll just go ahead and take a look. I am going to turn off, or actually we can just delete that other terrain from the scene, the one that was bugged and crashing view. We don't want that anymore. I am going to select the terrain, go to the numerics tab, and under position, just going to move it down on the Z a little bit, which is my up and down axis. This really might be a little too thick, so I might go back, but I'm going to show you what this is going to look like. And I'll just render out something a little bit smaller really quick. And this is with just the reset material, so we don't really have the water material loaded in yet. But you will be able to see the interaction between the procedural and this standard terrain that's going to eventually be the waterfall. So one way I could reduce this a little bit without having to recreate the entire object is just do what we were doing before, adding the picture, loading in that object, setting it to subtract. A very low amount, we can preview it. So we don't need a whole lot, just enough to thin out some of the edges. That did help a little bit. Can now bring the position up a little. The most, or probably one of the most important things besides the actual geometry of the waterfall is really the material. The material is going to either make or break your waterfall and how it's going to look. Just using a water shader alone is not really going to give you a good looking waterfall. I have designed and created a shader for waterfalls, a very foam based type waterfall. So I'm going to go ahead and load that in. And I will include this so that you can use it. Go ahead and take a look. And to start out, it really doesn't look all that bad. Would like to make a few modifications to it. One thing about this material, it is very light dependent. So depending on what angle you're viewing it at and what your lighting situation is, you may need to adjust a few settings in order to get it to work correctly with the scene. This one actually looks a little bit better if I go ahead and I'm just going to create a duplicate of the camera. But I do have one of the higher ones, camera 4, that I created earlier. And we'll take a look at it from a different angle to see light coming in a different direction. And as you can tell, this material really does look a lot better when you're looking down on it because of the way the transparency is set up, kind of like a Fresnel effect where looking at it through the sides, you're going to see a lot more of the material. It's going to become almost solid. So it does have a few intersection problems where we can just paint those out in the terrain editor. For the most part, it looks okay from this angle, so it's really a matter of adjusting the shader. So let's go ahead and take a look at what makes up my waterfall shader. I've got my contrast set fairly high. At the moment, it's set to 54. This is really going to be dependent on how detailed the terrain is. You can get a lot of different effects by adjusting the contrast. Lowering it will make a much smoother surface and the highlights won't be as intense. So for some surfaces it is better to decrease the contrast, and then the light will be more evenly dispersed. It really acts kind of like a Phong angle if you're familiar with Phong shaders or any sort of smoothing angles. So not a huge difference, but a somewhat noticeable one. Taking a look at what's really making up the material, we'll go ahead and open the function editor. And I have, basically this was a modified view preset. Trying to remember which one. I think I can find out. And I think it was based on the green glass preset, which I did make quite a few changes to, so I mean it's not really going to resemble the original material. But what we have is the color map, and then the alpha output, which is connected to a basic repeater, and a math pattern with water wave, and I believe that's a modification I made. And then I went ahead and just copied and pasted that so I could modify this a little bit differently and separate it to connect to the transparency and also connect it to the bump. The bump's going to pull out even more highlight and make the surface a lot rougher. I also went ahead after the combination of these for the transparency, or the variable transparency, and added the distance to object below. Now this causes the material to basically fade away around the edges where it becomes closer to the terrain object. That prevents any sort of really harsh seams showing up or transitions that are just going to be a little too obvious that it's just an intersecting object and not water that would be flowing over it. So that distance to object below is probably what makes it look the best. The main things for using this material in your own scenes, it is very scale dependent as well as light dependent, and depending on the scale in which you're using it. I have mine set to 10 for the overall scale. It is a world standard. The fading out option can be a little sensitive. For instance, if I bring it up to from just a few points up to 49, making it more murky, in other words, so it's not so transparent overall, it's going to make a very, very big difference and make the object appear a lot more solid. Once the object becomes too solid, we can start to see some of the harsher cutoffs just because the edges are overlapping. And that's one of the reasons why I had the contrast turned up higher, because it will help remove some of those areas. Another thing that can be adjusted is between the diffusion and ambient, raise or lower, to adjust their light dependence of an ambient situation or a diffuse for direct sun lighting. I do have a little bit of backlight showing as well, along with the color transmitted light, which is going to shine kind of a white or bluish white tone onto the object going through it. I don't have any real refraction set up because I just wanted to make more of a foam type layer. I didn't actually want to have water. Setting up a refraction might cause problems with the way the transparency is set up using the distance to object. If you want to take a look, what would be 1.33? Actually, we'll add another 3. Now we have 2 additional ray traces that are going to be applied, so it will take a little bit longer to render because we need to calculate the transparency as long with the refraction, which is what takes a little bit longer, and then also the built-in reflection. But it actually does look pretty nice, so I'm going to go ahead and let that finish out. And I actually really do like the way that looks. It does take a lot longer to render, but I think it's worth it. It's not something I'd want to use on the lower portions, except for where I wanted a lot of turbulence on the bottom. So I think what I want to do is set up a layered material. I'm going to add a layer, and keeping in mind the scale because it will reset once I add an additional layer. I'm going to go back and re-add Waterfall 2. So we have 10 as the overall. I'm going to set that to 1 and then individually set these other 2. The alpha boost, which is showing -50, is going to blend the 2 together. I don't want that entirely. How I want to control it is based on the altitude. So I'm going to set it about halfway. So the refraction material is going to be showing in the upper portion, and then the non-refracted water will be showing in the lower areas. Now, because of the way transparency works, we'll have to see how that's going to show up, because it looks like it did automatically disconnect a few things. And it almost looks like a different surface now. So I am going to go ahead and have to make a change because of the way the transparency is set up. And it looks like I might just need to reconnect. Taking the alpha, connecting it back to that color map, connect the transparency. And I am going to add a little bit of fuzziness on the steep area, and then add fuzziness for the top of the surface, since it is going to be climbing up. Now, with overlaying materials with transparency, it might not work all that well, and it might be something that just needs to be built in to the function itself and just as one material. So we'll just take a look and see how that's going to render out. And it does look like the altitude is not set high enough, so I'm going to go ahead and just cancel the render, go back and change the altitude range to set it a little bit higher, up to 0.5, and we can take a look at that. And this is still rendering out, but I think because the refracted material, having it on the bottom, is still causing the entire material to be or have refraction, including the layer we just added on top. So I'm going to go ahead and swap those around and take the transparency 1, 2, 3, 3, or 1.333 for the top waterfall, which is going to be the refracted, and then going to the layer underneath it, setting that refraction index to 1. And then when we go to the environment tab of that upmost layer, now we can modify this to just affect the top, add a little bit of bottom fuzziness. I'm going to turn off that steep fuzziness because it's a very steep material, so that might be causing issues as well, dispersing it. As you can see, as it's rendering, it's actually gotten much worse. So that's one thing whenever you're mixing transparent materials together. I'm going to go ahead and try to just increase the alpha boost and see if that will fix it. Otherwise, I will just have to work in the refraction index to be based on the altitude. And that is not working. So what I will do is delete this layer. I'll go back, set that scale to 10, go to the transparency, set the refraction index where we have 1.33. Go ahead and extract it. And it looks like we may have to do a little bit of converting because the refraction index in the function editor is showing as 1.66, even though I typed in 1.33. So if you ever need to evaluate what is going to be shown in the function editor, you can type a value, extract it, and the constant node that is created will be equal to that number. So 1 is equal to 1. Let's go ahead and type in 2. Extract it, and that is equal to 3. So that gives us our proper conversion we can use so that we can create basically it would be a map filter to sort that out correctly, or we can just cross multiply it. So we are going to have to build a little bit of refraction calculator. So this will actually be quite useful in the future. What I'm going to do is add in a couple of constant nodes. And what we're going to have is 1 and 2. And now that I'm thinking about it, it might actually be easier just to use a map filter for this. It'll perform the calculation, should be able to do it correctly for us. So I'm going to set the lower value to 1, the upper to 2, and then our output is going to be 1 to 3. And that should actually take care of our inputs. So we might need more than one of these, but if I add a constant node of 1.66, connect this, our output should be corrected, or we might need to actually modify that a little bit more. And I did just go ahead and change the number to 1.33 because we do know that is the input of the actual refraction index, and we know what it converted it to, which was 1.66, cutting out the last. Actually, we'll go ahead and just do 133. The map is set to lower 1, upper 2. Output is 1 to 3. So our extension, if we take a look down in the bottom of the node preview, it does tell us whenever you're going outside of 1, an automatic extension is turned on, it will tell you the calculation or that number. If you can't see the entire number, you can turn off the automatic extension, and then in this case we'll go ahead and add another decimal, or add another number on the end, and then turn on the automatic extension, turn it back off, and it looks like in this case it is rounding. Sometimes what you can do, if the automatic extension is turned on at first, it will create the number, and then if you turn it off, it'll allow you to move over and read the rest of the values. So that is kind of cool. So now we have our calculator, and what we want to do is go between set our map. And we really didn't need to create anything special because we do know the output, which was 1.66 and 1 that we're going to be mixing, but that's alright. So this should return a value of 1, and it does. And what we want to do is adjust the blending between 1.33 and 1. And we are going to do this directly within the node instead of layering anything on top of each other. What we need is connection to altitude. And what I want to do is add in a connectable constant number. Connect that to our altitude up at top, just so I can bring down the node a little bit lower. Connect our blender to that, and we're also going to connect this to filter. And we are going to use the map filter. And we want to set the lower value -1, upper value 1, output of 0, or let's do -1 to 2, or maybe 0.1. Actually, we'll do 1, sorry. And then 0.1 at -0.1 for the lower range. Altitude typically uses real values, so we might need to do a little bit of calculating. And because of the nature of this material, I think it's actually going to be easier to do this on a different material layer with a different channel in order to get it the way we want it, because we also have the overall scaling that's modified. So what I would like to do is add a layer, just hit X, change that top one to 1. So we have 10 for the waterfall, which is going to stay the same. That new layer, we're going to also set to 10, making sure it's world standard. And I'm going to go ahead into the color production, edit, and set up red and blue for the upper and lower, and then we're going to go to the environment, make sure that the altitude range is fully set, and now edit the function, and we want to set up the blender, or whatever we're going to need to blend these, and all we need to do is offset it to make sure that it's going to definitely transition over. I think instead I am going to use 2 constant colors instead of a color map, because that way we can use a blender with the same ratio setting, clip our ratio, and once we can see these showing up correctly, we can just transfer over the settings to the lower material and then delete this one. So this is just an easier way to modify things. And what I've gone ahead and done to compensate for the scaling, in order for us to be able to use the map filter as real units, I've multiplied the altitude by 0.1. So this is the blender ratio between the red and blue, and actually these are backwards, so I will, from what I have the constant number set at, so I'll just need to swap those around. So blue will need to be the 133, and red will need to be 1. So basically what I have is the multiply by 0.1 from the altitude, and the map is set to output range 0 to 1, which is what controls the ratio from 0 to 1, and then the lower value 100, upper 200, so that's going from 100 meters to 200, or roughly. So I can go ahead and just copy this, click OK, go to the waterfall, edit the function, and paste that in, and delete the current connections, and then I just need to swap the refractions over. And if I do want to have these a little bit closer, I can drop this down to maybe 175. I could do 1225 or 125, 160, 115. Because scaling the refraction index might be kind of interesting looking. We'll have to see. So go ahead and give that a try. So that is showing up a lot better now, where we have that nice transition. Another thing we could do is adjust and connect the fuzziness option or the murkiness option to that altitude. Or if we want the refraction of the water to show up on flatter areas, so that would be where it's colliding with the surface and looks very turbulent right now in those portions with the refraction. We could also set that up to be controlled by slope, so that steeper areas are going to have no refraction, and then the flat areas will have that water refraction. So there's a lot of ways we could go through and customize this. I do want to go ahead and just load in terrain materials so we can start to see things a little bit better. So this is it rendered with one of my terrain materials, layered material. And I'll be also adding some additional layers to it as well. I do think that the water would really benefit from the slope-controlled refraction. And we can use that altitude controller for something else if needed. So what I'm going to do is add in a slope evaluation layer. We can load in the color map from the other parts of the tips and tricks training and use that to evaluate the slope. So connect that to the slope. Just ignore the atmosphere and lighting for now. Just to be safe, we'll set the scale to 1. So I do want the refraction to show up within the red and going a little bit into the green area, just with that fall off. So we can use this color reference in order to set up a color map that's going to filter out the slope for us. And just to get an idea of our key points before we go ahead and delete this layer, I'm going to edit the color map, and we can see that we're at 0.5 for the full green, so I'll probably clip it out, maybe 0.75. So we can delete this layer, now go back into our function, and use our slope controller map, so we can add in color map, edit the color map, we're going to do RGB values 0, 0, 0, and then this is going to be at position 0.75, and then I'm also going to have a much sharper cutoff, so we can create another key point, making it fully white. So maybe we will have a little bit of blend. And we'll set the 0.75 for the full refraction, and then set the fall off to 0.5. Click OK. Connect that to slope. Add in math node, conversion, color to brightness. And then we also want to clip this out So we're going to add in filter, map, lower value is going to be -1, upper value is 1, and that is going to equal an output range of 0 to 1. And we'll just go ahead and connect the map to the colored brightness, and then we can connect our ratio to that. Now, there's a possibility that once I disconnect this function, we'll lose it. So rather than losing it, I am going to add in a blender, combiner node set to blender, and connect that to the map and set the ratio to 1, which is going to override it and connect to the new function. We could also blend the two together as well. I think I am going to need to bring that down because once we reach that fall-off point, the refraction really doesn't appear to be showing very well. So I will go ahead, edit the color map, and we're going to set the lowest point to 0.25. Let's go ahead and bring that to 0.5. For the refraction showing it 0.5, and then the fall off going down a little bit lower. So I might need to adjust the fall off a little bit more, maybe transition it a little bit better. We'll see. I'm not really going to be spending any more time working on this part of the material. Overall, it doesn't look too bad. Just a few tweaks here and there. I could also use that blender that I used to switch between the two controls, whether using altitude or slope, and we could add those two together. So we could use both of them, or we could just blend and kind of do a mix. We could also multiply them or subtract one from the other. So a lot of different ways to control that. I am going to clip the ratio 0 to 1 to make sure that anything out of bounds will be showing up correctly. I'll do that for the other one as well, even though there's nothing really connected to that ratio, just to make sure. So now one thing we could do is if we want to add more of a mist to the surrounding or the collision areas, we can create another waterfall material or copy the current one that we have. So I can copy and paste, edit the object, and we would want to clip out or remove the areas that we're not going to be using. So we just want this to be showing up where the water is going to fall on top of the rock. So a lot on the bottom and then a little bits up around the rest of the areas. So we can basically remove all the upper levels, and I'm just going to use the clip as a reference to know where I should be cutting things out. We can start with the center area. And pretty much all of this can be clipped out. So we can go to the Paint tab, go to Altitude, which is still set to -0.04. And now I can just use this, turn off the constraint to clipping range, and remove those portions. And I'm going to scale my brush down, remove a little bit more. We can show the scene if you want to work on this and be a little bit better representation. We're going to be removing the lower areas. And I am going to reduce my flow, change my size a little. So just removing what we're not going to need, and just keeping the areas that are going to be really colliding and having the most impact. So whatever water is going to have the most velocity to be able to create a nice mist and spray. So what we can do, because we can't use this exact same one in this same layout, just because it's too fine, what we're going to do is go back to the effects and use Plateaus in order to spread that out more. And we still need to go back and modify the original water surface as well, because it does have too smooth of areas. So I'm going to go back to that really quick, and we can see what it currently looks like. I want to add some stones and some grit, and then just one click of alluvium, and that should produce something a little bit better. And now this new terrain that was added, we are going to rename the material Waterfall Mist. And I don't know if the refraction is going to be a good idea for this. Probably not. So I'm going to go ahead and set up another blender just to preserve what we have in case we do want to use it at a constant number of 1, so that the refraction is set to 1. Move the blender ratio to 1. So that way that is turned off. Go to the transparency, make it a little bit clearer. And then we can modify the scale as well, so that it's not identical. I'll go ahead and bring the scale to 12. And let's just take a look without making any more modifications, although we will need to probably plateau it a little bit more just to see how it's blending. Take a look at a render. Because this object is so small, and there's not a whole lot of volume to it, not a lot of this material shows without a higher murkiness value. But since we are going to be increasing the scale of it, I'm going to wait to make any more adjustments to it. So I'm going to go back into the terrain, and we can run the plateaus again. Do a little bit of thermal erosion to lift up the edges. And it's just going to kind of blob it out. And we should be able to see a lot more showing. What we can also do for the meantime is turn off the other water, which takes a little bit longer to render. And since we are not really looking at that right now, even though it's important because of the way they blend together, we can still get a good idea of what the mist is going to look like just rendering it by itself. So that's definitely much more defined and really shows up a lot better than it did before. So depending on how it's going to interact with the other water, really have to see how we're going to need to manipulate it further if we need to. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with these how they're at right now. And we're going to move on to just one or two other things.